You know, there's something about watching an entire species get turned away at every port in the galaxy that makes you question everything you thought you knew about civilization. I've seen empires fall and alliances shatter, but nothing prepared me for what happened when humanity did the one thing nobody else would. You know, there's something about watching an entire civilization become homeless that makes you question cosmic justice. I've seen supernovas wipe out binary systems and black holes consume galactic arms. But there's a special kind of horror in watching a society meticulously unravel itself to avoid total annihilation. The Velnar homeworld didn't just die, it was systematically dismantled by a quantum entropy wave that even their advanced tech couldn't stop. Imagine watching a planet slowly unravel like a poorly knitted sweater, with continental plates separating cleanly along tectonic seams and oceans evaporating into structured mist. Their scientists had about 3 weeks warning, which in disaster terms is like knowing the exact date of your funeral but not being allowed to tell anyone about it. Their generation ships weren't majestic arcs but desperate, cobbled together vessels with failing life support. I watched them retrofit mining barges with makeshift hydroponics and convert cargo haulers into refugee transports using whatever alloy scraps they could salvage. The life support systems were patched together with components that had a failure rate of nearly 40% within the first month. You could track their fleet by the trail of emergency oxygen canisters they kept jettisoning. I watched their leadership make the call: abandon 3 billion souls who couldn't be evacuated, or risk total extinction. The selection criteria were brutally practical: scientists, engineers, childbearing adults, and anyone who could operate essential systems. Everyone else got a farewell transmission and coordinates to emergency bunkers that everyone knew wouldn't last more than 6 standard months. The final broadcast from the surface showed people calmly organizing supply distribution points even as the atmosphere began boiling away. Their navigation data showed 47 potential sanctuary systems within reach of their dwindling power reserves. Each course projection accounted for gravitational slingshots around neutron stars and delicate maneuvers through nebular clouds to conserve energy. Their margin of error was so slim that a miscalculation of even 0.01% in trajectory would leave them drifting between star systems with dead engines. Every FTL broadcast they sent was a masterpiece of diplomatic pleading, carefully edited to hide their technological disadvantages. Their communications team removed all evidence of systems failures from the transmissions, using stock footage from their golden age and carefully masking the power fluctuations in their broadcast signals. They emphasized their scientific knowledge and cultural achievements while downplaying their current desperate state, like someone applying for a job while their house burns down in the background. The first rejection came from the Xenox consortium within hours, a brutally efficient message citing biocompatibility concerns. Their response was 15 words long and included 17 attachments of legal disclaimers. The Xenox had analyzed Velnar biological data and determined their microbiome might contaminate local ecosystems, which in diplomatic terms translates to, "We don't want your germs in our backyard." Let me tell you about galactic hospitality. It's basically a go die elsewhere policy with better PR. The Velnar followed every standard refugee protocol to the letter, submitting comprehensive biological compatibility charts and meticulously calculated resource consumption estimates that would make an accountant weep with joy. They provided 3 centuries of medical records, atmospheric preference studies, and even cultural integration proposals, showing how they could contribute to host economies. Each data packet was crafted with the precision of a master jeweler setting diamonds, designed to reassure potential hosts that accepting them would be an investment rather than a burden. The Kyrian Empire offered them temporary asteroid mining contracts in exchange for cultural assimilation. Programs, a fancy term for slavery. Their proposal specified 20-hour work cycles in radiation-heavy asteroid belts with safety standards that violated 14 galactic conventions. The assimilation program required Velnar children to be separated from parents for accelerated cultural education and mandated biological modifications to make them more compatible with Kyrian environments. It was essentially a corporate takeover disguised as humanitarian aid, complete with stock options for the Velnar leadership if they Cooperated, I accessed the classified briefings from the Galactic Council. They'd secretly labeled the Velnar a civilization-level contagion risk. Their internal memos cited unverified reports about Velnar neural patterns causing ideological contamination in other species. The risk assessment teams projected that accepting Velnar refugees could destabilize social structures across multiple systems within 5 generations. They recommended complete isolation protocols and suggested redirecting the refugees toward uninhabited systems that would naturally limit their expansion capabilities. Their 7th rejection came with an escort of battle cruisers that accidentally damaged 2 refugee ships during inspection. The battle cruisers performed aggressive scanning maneuvers that overloaded Velnar shield generators, causing secondary explosions in engine compartments. The inspection team then cited unstable vessel conditions as justification for denying docking privileges. Repairing the damage cost them 3 weeks of travel supplies and forced the abandonment of 1 ship, whose structural integrity had been compromised beyond repair. By the 12th rejection, Velnar birth rates had dropped to 0, a species-wide trauma response to impending extinction. Their biological systems literally shut down reproductive functions, a physiological reaction to overwhelming existential threat that their scientists couldn't reverse. Medical teams reported widespread cases of what they called future blindness, the inability to imagine any timeline beyond the next few months. The collective psychological weight of constant rejection had triggered an evolutionary safeguard against bringing children into hopeless situations. The final rejection from the Tholian hegemony included a mapped course directly into a neutron star's gravity well. Their transmission politely suggested that dignified species conclusion was preferable to undignified resource depletion scenarios. The coordinates came with detailed calculations showing how the gravitational forces would provide instant, painless termination of consciousness for all vessels simultaneously. It was the galactic equivalent of handing someone a loaded gun while smiling and suggesting they do the right thing. So there I was, watching humanity discover the crisis through the galaxy's worst connected Wi-Fi network. Their deep space monitoring stations were still using repurposed military arrays from the Centauri conflict, which meant their sensor coverage had more blind spots than a planetary transit system during meteor season. The equipment was so outdated that maintenance crews had to fabricate replacement parts using 3D printers because the original manufacturers had gone out of business decades earlier. Signal processing involved manual calibration of analog components that most species had abandoned for fully digital systems centuries ago. A junior communications officer named Lena Petrova noticed anomalous packet losses in deep space telemetry that didn't match any known interference patterns. She was running routine diagnostics on the Cerberus array near Jupiter's orbit when her console started flagging data corruption in Sector Gamma 7. The errors manifested as rhythmic signal degradation every 47 seconds, too consistent for natural cosmic interference, yet too irregular for mechanical failure. Her initial report got classified as low priority because the system automatically attributed the anomalies to pulsar interference from a nearby neutron star. She'd been tracking what she thought was pulsar interference until she decoded the error correction protocols. The repeating pattern matched nothing in humanity's astronomical databases, but it aligned perfectly with standard galactic distress signal framing sequences. Petrova spent 3 nights cross-referencing obsolete communication protocols from early exosolar expeditions before identifying the pattern as a Velnar emergency broadcast wrapper. The signal strength indicated the transmission originated from just beyond the Oort cloud, which meant someone was bleeding data practically on humanity's doorstep. The Velnar's encryption was laughably outdated. Humanity cracked it using modified gaming rigs in under 6 hours. Their security protocols used quantum key distribution methods that had been compromised 2 centuries earlier during the Sirius data wars. A team at the Lunar Cryptography Division realized they could brute force the decryption using repurposed gaming processors running modified asteroid mining algorithms. The decryption revealed not just coordinates and resource requests, but thousands of personal messages from refugees saying goodbye to loved ones left behind. Petrova's report reached the UN Colonial Affairs Director during his daughter's birthday party. He left immediately. He was cutting cake when his secure tablet displayed the priority alert. containing both the decrypted Velnar transmission and Petrova's analysis of their deteriorating life support systems. The director excused himself without explanation, leaving the birthday decorations still hanging as he authorized an emergency response protocol that hadn't been activated since the Martian water rights conflict. His departure triggered a chain of notifications that woke up every colonial administrator across the solar system within minutes. Here's the thing about human compassion. It always fights a bloody battle against human practicality first. The emergency session of the Global Security Council revealed 63 potential crisis scenarios, each with flowcharts mapping everything from resource allocation conflicts to interplanetary quarantine breaches. Delegates spent 14 hours arguing over containment protocols while the Velnar ships drifted closer, with failing life support. The scenario models projected everything from cultural contamination to complete economic destabilization, with probability percentages that shifted every time someone presented new data. Colonial Affairs predicted total economic collapse if Velnar resource needs exceeded projections by just 2.3%. Their analysts presented spreadsheets showing how even minor miscalculations in caloric requirements or oxygen consumption could trigger supply chain failures across the outer colonies. The margin of error was thinner than the atmosphere on Mars, with cascading effects that would impact agricultural production, manufacturing outputs, and energy distribution for years. They recommended a full planetary economic impact assessment before making any commitment, a process that would take 6 months the Velnar didn't have. The Mars Confederation threatened secession if Earth prioritized aliens over colonial development. Their transmission cited 13 treaty violations and included a draft Declaration of Independence that had already been pre-approved by their legislative council. Martian officials argued that their own resource shortages deserved priority over unknown extraterrestrial needs, pointing to water rationing in the dome cities and energy shortages that limited industrial expansion. They'd even calculated the military cost of enforcing Martian compliance, which involved retrofitting asteroid defense systems for planetary bombardment. Military intelligence presented fabricated evidence suggesting Velnar were biological weapons disguised as refugees. Their analysts manipulated sensor data to show anomalous energy signatures around the refugee ships and drafted reports claiming the Velnar biological makeup included synthetic components. They suggested the entire refugee crisis was an invasion strategy designed to bypass conventional defenses, using emotional appeals as tactical weapons. The briefing included computer simulations showing how Velnar genetic material could be weaponized against human populations within months of arrival. The deciding vote came from Indonesia's representative, who cited her grandmother's experience as a wartime refugee. She described how her grandmother survived displacement during the Pacific conflicts by depending on the generosity of strangers who had nothing to gain from helping. Her testimony included declassified documents showing how refugee integration had historically strengthened, rather than weakened, societies that chose compassion over isolation. She ended her statement by pointing out that humanity's technological advancement meant nothing if it didn't include moral progression, then cast the vote that overrode all economic and military objections. I've seen surrender documents signed with less ceremony than humanity's simple 3-word transmission. Galactic treaties involving entire star systems often get more bureaucratic attention than humanity gave to what became the most important communication in their history. The message had to bypass 17 layers of bureaucratic approval, using an emergency diplomatic channel that hadn't been activated since the climate accords of the previous century. Each clearance level required biometric verification and committee approval, with system protocols demanding impact assessments at every stage. The channel itself was designed for planetary emergencies, not interstellar communications, which meant engineers had to jury-rig amplification systems designed for atmospheric disturbances to handle deep space transmission requirements. Communications. Directorate argued for 6 hours over whether to include resource demands or conditions. One faction insisted on attaching preliminary requirements about cultural integration and resource contribution, fearing that unconditional acceptance would set dangerous precedents. Another group argued for detailed logistical instructions about approach vectors and quarantine procedures, wanting to avoid any potential misunderstandings during first contact. The debate escalated into semantic arguments about whether welcome implied temporary sanctuary or permanent residence, with legal analysts citing centuries of human immigration, law that had never contemplated extraterrestrial applications. The final draft was composed by a first contact linguist who'd lost her family in the Europa colony collapse. She recognized the Velnar desperation from personal experience, having lived through the 3-year rescue operation after the ice shelf fracture that killed 12,000 settlers. Her draft removed all conditional language and procedural requirements, reducing the message to its emotional core rather than its practical implications. She argued that after 17 rejections, the Velnar needed assurance, not instructions, and that humanity's greatest strength was offering hope without immediately quantifying its cost. They used the oldest known human language of Sumerian as a deliberate counter to galactic formality. The choice represented both symbolic and practical considerations. Sumerian cuneiform was humanity's first written language, representing the dawn of recorded communication, while its obscurity provided some encryption against potential interception by other species. Linguists had to modify the ancient script to accommodate modern transmission protocols, creating a hybrid system that used clay tablet symbolism translated into binary code. The message's simplicity allowed it to bypass most automated translation filters that typically screened for complex diplomatic terminology. The Velnar received, "Come, we wait," on a continuous loop across every frequency humanity could broadcast. Transmission arrays from Mercury to Neptune aimed coordinated signals toward the refugee fleet, creating an overlapping broadcast pattern that ensured reception even with failing Velnar sensors. The lunar communications team maintained the signal for 72 hours straight, overriding all other non-essential transmissions despite protests from colonial administrations and commercial interests. Earth's rotation meant different arrays took over transmission duties as planets moved in and out of alignment, creating an unbroken chain of invitation across the solar system. The message repeated every 11 seconds, synchronized with the Velnar's internal timekeeping system that humanity had decrypted from their earlier broadcasts. Let me be clear, humanity's generosity came with a price tag that would make a Kardashev Type 2 civilization wince. The actual resource expenditure wasn't just about slotting a few extra mouths into existing systems. It meant fundamentally restructuring their entire orbital infrastructure with the urgency of someone trying to rebuild an engine mid-flight. They had to create sustainable environments for a species with completely different biological requirements while maintaining their own civilization's stability. A balancing act that required recalculating every resource allocation model they'd used for decades. The Lagrange point reception facilities required disassembling 3 orbital agricultural stations that were feeding 15% of the outer colonies. Engineers had to carefully extract hydrogen cultivation modules and atmospheric processors from functioning space farms, then reassemble them into quarantine zones that could accommodate Velnar physiological needs. Each disassembly operation created food shortage cascades that required emergency rationing on mining outposts and orbital habitats. The replacement food production had to be shifted to terrestrial farming, which increased pressure on already stressed agricultural systems and water reclamation networks. Medical quarantine protocols meant canceling all off-world travel for 18 months, stranding millions. Commercial spaceliners got grounded at their ports of origin, leaving passengers stuck wherever they'd last docked. Cargo shipments between colonies got postponed indefinitely, creating shortages of everything from medical supplies to machine parts. Martian colonists couldn't return to Earth, lunar researchers couldn't rotate back to their home stations, and asteroid miners found themselves extending 6-month contracts into 2-year marathons without family contact. The economic impact of frozen mobility exceeded most wartime transportation restrictions humanity had ever implemented. They converted Antarctica into a temporary biosphere, triggering rapid ice melt that flooded coastal cities. Engineers installed thermal regulation systems designed to maintain Velnar-compatible temperatures, which inevitably accelerated polar ice dissolution faster than any climate model predicted. The meltwater release raised ocean levels enough to submerge low-lying urban areas, requiring emergency evacuation of 27 coastal cities. Seawall construction projects that were scheduled for completion over decades had to be rushed into existence within months, with crews working around the clock using construction methods that had never been tested at that scale. The relocation cost alone dwarfed the gross domestic product of most pre-spaceflight nations. The economic impact exceeded the worst predictions, but triggered technological innovations in resource recycling. The necessity of supporting two species with limited resources forced breakthroughs in closed-loop life support and waste reclamation that would have taken centuries under normal research conditions. Engineers developed water purification systems that could recycle 98% of liquid waste and atmospheric processors that could maintain optimal conditions with 30% less energy consumption. These advancements eventually paid back the initial investment multiple times over. But during the implementation phase, the economic strain nearly collapsed interplanetary trade networks and required emergency restructuring of entire colonial economies. You know how sometimes two cultures meet and it's beautiful? This was the opposite of that. I've witnessed first contact scenarios across 7 spiral arms, from elegant tea ceremonies between silicon-based life forms to elaborate genetic compatibility rituals that lasted entire orbital cycles. Humanity and the Velnar managed to turn introduction protocols into something resembling a multi-species safety drill gone horribly wrong. They approached each other with the cautious optimism of bomb disposal technicians working with outdated manuals. The first Velnar transport docked with incompatible atmosphere processors, nearly suffocating both species. Their environmental systems were calibrated for a nitrogen-argon mix that human docking clamps interpreted as hazardous material containment breaches. Automatic safety protocols triggered emergency seals that locked both crews inside their respective vessels, while atmosphere scrubbers went into overdrive. Human technicians started passing out from oxygen depletion, just as Velnar respiration rates accelerated to dangerous levels, trying to compensate for thinning air. The docking bay turned into a biochemical nightmare where everyone was simultaneously trying not to die while apologizing for almost killing the other side. Velnar greetings involved subtle pheromone releases that humans interpreted as aggression signals. Their cultural customs required emitting complex chemical signals through specialized skin pores during introductions, which human olfactory systems registered as threat indicators. Security teams went to high alert when diplomats started unconsciously perceiving peaceful delegates as imminent dangers. The physiological response triggered adrenaline spikes and defensive posturing that the Velnar then misread as hostile intentions. What should have been formal greetings turned into standoffs where both sides were convinced the other was about to attack, with translators desperately trying to explain that nobody was actually threatening anyone. Human handshakes caused second-degree burns on Velnar skin due to acidic sweat differences. Human perspiration contains lactic acid compounds that Velnar dermis processed as corrosive substances. The first attempted handshake left a Velnar diplomat with blistered palm tissue that required emergency medical treatment. Their medical team initially assumed humanity had deployed some kind of chemical weapon during the greeting ceremony. The incident created temporary panic until biochemists identified the compatibility issue, by which point 3 other delegation members had already suffered similar injuries from casual contact. Protocol teams had to implement immediate no-touch policies while designing specialized interaction gloves. The first successful interaction occurred between a human engineer and Velnar mechanic over broken toilet systems. They found themselves staring at the same clogged waste reclamation unit from opposite sides of a maintenance hatch, both equally frustrated by hydraulic pressure failures. The human used gesture-based troubleshooting, while the Velnar employed diagnostic tools that emitted universal engineering symbols. They spent 47 minutes passing tools back and forth through the service opening, solving the mechanical problem through shared technical understanding that bypassed all cultural barriers. Their collaboration fixed the sanitation systems and established the first functional communication channel between species, all because a malfunctioning toilet required both their expertise to unclog. So there we were, facing interstellar war because someone tried to serve lasagna to a species that photosynthesizes. Human cultural attachés had prepared what they considered quintessential Earth cuisine, Italian, Chinese, Mexican dishes, without realizing the Velnar digestive system processed electromagnetic radiation, not organic matter. The initial banquet featured 27 courses that the Velnar politely arranged into geometric patterns on their plates, while slowly starving under the inadequate artificial lighting. Protocol officers misinterpreted their food arrangements as cultural rituals rather than desperation, leading to weeks of increasingly elaborate meals that satisfied nobody's nutritional needs. Human nutritionists spent months developing culturally appropriate meal plans that were universally rejected. They created light-frequency recipes based on incomplete Velnar biological data, resulting in spectral combinations that either provided insufficient energy or caused photosynthetic burnout. The meal plans involved precisely calibrated LED arrays, serving specific wavelengths at designated intervals. But the intensity variations triggered migraine equivalents in Velnar neural networks. Their rejection wasn't about taste, it was about survival, as miscalibrated light meals left them lethargic and disoriented during critical integration activities. Velnar required specific light frequencies for feeding that disrupted human circadian rhythms. Their optimal feeding spectrum included ultraviolet bands that caused humans to develop skin lesions and vision problems after prolonged exposure. Shared meal facilities had to operate with partitioned lighting systems that created stark visual divides between species. The light pollution from Velnar dining areas bled into human living quarters, disrupting sleep patterns and causing widespread insomnia among station personnel. Shift workers started making errors in critical systems due to cumulative sleep deprivation, nearly causing 3 separate life support failures in 1 week. They accidentally intoxicated an entire sector by releasing food processing enzymes into air recycling. Velnar metabolic processes involved emitting specialized enzymes to break down photons, which they normally reabsorbed through their skin. In enclosed environments, these enzymes circulated through ventilation systems and interacted with human sweat and skin oils to create psychoactive compounds. The resulting exposure left 78 humans and 30 Velnar in a confused state, where they attempted to communicate through interpretive dance while rearranging furniture into what they claimed were energy-efficient formations. Medical teams had to administer sobering agents while engineers installed enzyme scrubbing filters throughout the ventilation network. The breakthrough came when a Velnar chef tried human coffee and developed a galactic addiction. Curious about the dark liquid humans consumed so obsessively, a Velnar food technician sampled leftover coffee grounds and discovered the caffeine interacted with their photosynthetic receptors to create unprecedented energy efficiency. They found they could process 30% more light energy with the same exposure time when combined with caffeine absorption. This discovery led to developing light-infused coffee analogs that both species could consume together, creating the first shared consumption ritual that actually benefited both physiologies. Coffee stations became neutral territory where humans drank their brew, while Velnar absorbed caffeine-enhanced light spectra from specially modified lamps, finally establishing common ground through mutually beneficial stimulation. Here's the thing about trust. It's not built in meeting rooms. It's built in malfunctioning airlocks. I've watched species sign peace accords with fancy calligraphy and ceremonial handshakes that fell apart the first time a ventilation system needed emergency repairs. Real trust gets forged when your survival depends on someone whose language you don't speak following procedures. They've never trained on using equipment that wasn't designed for either of you. Joint teams were assigned to repair critical systems, despite language and technical compatibility barriers that would make a universal translator overload. They paired engineers who communicated through gesture-based technical diagrams and shared diagnostic tools rather than words. The Velnar used 3-dimensional holographic schematics, while humans relied on flat-screen interfaces, creating constant translation errors in torque specifications and pressure tolerances. Tool compatibility was so poor that they had to fabricate adapter pieces using onboard printers, with each team improvising solutions based on half-understood technical requirements from the other side. A pressure leak in Sector Gamma required simultaneous manual override from both species to prevent catastrophe. The emergency involved a fractured coolant line that was flooding the compartment with hazardous chemicals, requiring immediate isolation through 2 separate control panels on opposite sides of the bulkhead. Human safety protocols demanded visual confirmation before initiating override sequences, while Velnar procedures required thermal verification of system status. The countdown to compartment breach gave them 90 seconds to coordinate actions across cultural and technical divides with no margin for error. The Velnar hesitated. Their cultural memory contained stories of Maintenance accidents used as extermination methods. 3 previous refugee groups in their history had perished when host species engineered deliberate system failures during joint operations. Their technical manuals included whole chapters on sabotage detection and survival protocols for cooperative projects that turned lethal. The engineering team froze when the override sequence began, their hands hovering over controls while their training screamed warnings about trusting other species with life-critical systems. The human side completed their activation sequence while watching their counterparts remain motionless, creating a dangerous imbalance in the safety protocol. Human engineer Maria Gonzalez remained at her station despite failing safety protocols, proving commitment. Her console showed the Velnar hadn't initiated their sequence, which meant completing her own override would create a pressure differential that could rupture the entire sector. Standard procedure demanded immediate evacuation when partnered override failed, but she maintained her position while recalibrating the emergency containment fields to compensate for the missing activation. Her actions created a temporary buffer that gave the Velnar team 30 additional seconds to overcome their hesitation, all while her environment suit registered rising radiation levels from the compromised coolant system. She didn't look toward the evacuation route or check her own life signs, focusing entirely on maintaining the unstable equilibrium through manual adjustments that weren't in any safety manual. Let me tell you about the moment humanity realized they'd adopted galactic-level geniuses by accident. It wasn't during some formal demonstration or technological exchange. It happened in a rec room where Velnar children were doodling quantum state equations on scrap paper like other kids might draw cartoon characters. Their play involved manipulating multi-dimensional matrices that human physicists needed supercomputers to solve, treating complex orbital mechanics problems like simple pattern recognition games. Educators initially thought they were just drawing decorative symbols until mathematicians recognized the notations as solutions to energy distribution problems that had stumped research teams for months. Velnar children were observed solving complex quantum equations as recreational puzzles during their free time. They'd cluster around holographic projectors, manipulating virtual particles with finger gestures that represented entanglement states human scientists could only describe with pages of mathematical notation. Their games involved configuring optimal quantum computing arrays, using principles that hadn't been published in human scientific literature yet. Teachers reported that the children seemed to approach problems holistically rather than sequentially, seeing solutions as complete patterns rather than step-by-step processes. This systemic thinking allowed them to design efficient manufacturing centers and sustainable micro-ecosystems that operated with minimal resource expenditure. Their biological neural networks operated on quantum entanglement principles humans barely understood. Velnar brains utilized naturally occurring quantum effects that allowed simultaneous processing across multiple probability states. This gave them an innate understanding of complex systems that functioned as integrated wholes rather than collections of individual components. They could intuitively grasp how modifications in one area would ripple through entire networks, whether designing furniture layouts or optimizing waste management systems. This comprehensive understanding of interconnected systems enabled them to create advanced electronics from limited resources while maintaining production efficiency. They could detect spatial anomalies that human sensors registered as background noise. Their perceptual systems could identify gravitational fluctuations and dimensional instabilities that human equipment filtered out as sensor static. During navigation exercises, Velnar crew members would occasionally point out regions of space that human instruments showed as empty void, but which later investigation revealed contained micro-wormholes or temporal distortions. This ability proved particularly valuable for identifying safe transit routes through regions previously considered unnavigable due to sensor interference or anomalous readings. Velnar teenager fixed Earth's failing orbital defense grid using parts from a broken coffee maker. The grid had suffered cascade failures during a solar flare event, with repair teams estimating 72 hours for full restoration. The teenager accessed maintenance schematics through public terminals, identified the critical failure points in the power distribution network, and fabricated replacement components using discarded appliance parts and a common 3D printer. Their repair involved rerouting energy flows through unconventional pathways that human engineers hadn't considered because they violated standard design protocols. The system was back online within 3 hours, operating at 15% higher efficiency than its original specifications. This incident demonstrated how their approach to problem-solving viewed challenges as opportunities for innovation rather than obstacles to overcome. You know how sometimes the universe gives you lemons? The Velnar gave humanity FTL citrus. Their arrival triggered technological advancements that bypassed centuries of incremental research and development, creating breakthroughs in fields humanity hadn't even properly conceptualized yet. The economic transformation wasn't gradual. It was tectonic, reshaping entire industries within months rather than decades. What started as humanitarian aid became the greatest technological transfer in human history, all because someone decided compassion might be worth the logistical headache. Velnar material science knowledge allowed synthesis of room temperature superconductors from lunar regolith. Their techniques involved using common mining waste products that humanity had been dumping back into crater floors for centuries. The process required specific molecular alignment procedures that used ambient solar radiation rather than energy-intensive manufacturing systems. They demonstrated how to create superconducting cables that could transport energy across planetary distances with negligible loss, using fabrication methods simple enough to implement in orbital workshops with basic equipment. The discovery meant power could be transmitted from solar collection arrays to colony worlds, without conversion losses or infrastructure limitations. Traditional energy corporations tried to suppress the technology to protect trillion-dollar investments. They launched lobbying campaigns questioning the safety of Velnar superconductors and filed regulatory complaints about manufacturing standards. Corporate security teams attempted to confiscate research data under intellectual property claims, while media outlets owned by energy interests published stories about potential systemic risks. The suppression efforts included sabotaging demonstration projects and bribing officials to delay certification processes. Their resistance created temporary market instability as investors tried to determine whether revolutionary technology or established interest would prevail. Their biological computing principles revolutionized AI development while solving ethical constraints. Velnar neural network designs incorporated natural limitation protocols that prevented runaway optimization scenarios. Their systems used quantum entanglement principles to create consciousness models that respected free will boundaries while maintaining operational efficiency. This approach eliminated the need for external ethical oversight committees, since the constraints were embedded in the fundamental architecture. The resulting artificial intelligences could solve complex problems without developing the dangerous goal-oriented behaviors that had plagued previous human AI experiments. Within 5 years, human Velnar hybrid tech eliminated energy scarcity across the Sol system. The superconductor network allowed efficient distribution of fusion power from orbital generators to even the most remote outposts. Energy costs dropped to negligible levels, transforming economic models that had been based on resource allocation for centuries. Manufacturing facilities could operate without power limitations. Agricultural systems could expand using optimized lighting arrays, and transportation networks shifted to electromagnetic propulsion systems that required minimal energy input. The economic revolution wasn't just about having more energy. It was about rebuilding civilization around abundance rather than scarcity. The transformation extended beyond energy into manufacturing, construction, and even social systems. Waste heat from industrial processes got repurposed for environmental control systems, while material recycling reached near-total efficiency using Velnar molecular separation techniques. Their integrated approach to system design created closed-loop economies where output from one process became input for another, minimizing resource extraction and environmental impact. Economic value shifted from controlling scarce resources to managing efficient abundance, creating entirely new industries focused on optimization rather than production. The solar system entered an economic phase that historians would later call the post-scarcity transition, though at the time it just felt like everything suddenly worked better. So there we were, just getting comfortable when the neighbors showed up with planet crackers and bad attitudes. The same species that couldn't spare a single oxygen molecule for the Velnar refugees suddenly developed intense interest in human Velnar technological developments. Their diplomatic approach involved warships instead of ambassadors, with fleet formations that positioned orbital weapon systems where everyone could appreciate their destructive potential. It was the galactic equivalent of showing up to a neighborhood barbecue with, flamethrowers and demanding the secret family recipe for potato salad. The Kyrian Empire demanded technology sharing. Under galactic exploitation treaties humanity never signed, their legal teams transmitted documents citing obscure interstellar conventions that allegedly required emerging civilizations to surrender advanced technologies to established powers. The treaties themselves were ancient agreements between empires that no longer existed, but the Kyrians argued precedent extended through successor states. Their demands specifically targeted the room temperature superconductors and quantum computing systems that had revolutionized human infrastructure. Claiming these advancements threatened galactic energy market stability, the documentation included calculated royalty payments that would have transferred 90% of the technology's economic value to Kyrian control. They blockaded Mars with battle fleets while diplomats threatened orbital bombardment of Earth. The blockade involved 72 warships, positioning themselves along Martian approach vectors, effectively stranding the colony's population without regular supply shipments. Simultaneously, Kyrian ambassadors delivered ultimatums to Earth's leadership with detailed scenarios about kinetic bombardment impacts on major population centers. Their projections showed casualty estimates for various cities based on different yield weapons, accompanied by timetables for compliance before initiating attacks. The coordination between military action and diplomatic pressure created a comprehensive strategy designed to overwhelm human decision-making capacities through simultaneous threats. The Velnar revealed they'd secretly been mapping Kyrian military vulnerabilities for decades. While fleeing their homeworld, they'd analyzed every rejection transmission for tactical intelligence, identifying patterns in Kyrian communication protocols and military response procedures. Their refugee ships had passive sensors collecting data on Kyrian fleet formations and weapon system signatures during each rejection encounter. This intelligence operation continued even after settling in human space, with Velnar analysts correlating new observations with archived data to identify strategic weaknesses. Their findings included precise information about Kyrian supply chain dependencies, command structure fault lines, and defensive system limitations that weren't in any known galactic database. The revelation came during an emergency Security Council meeting where human military leaders were discussing concession strategies. Velnar representatives presented their findings without dramatic flair, simply transferring data packets that contained complete analyses of Kyrian military capabilities and limitations. The information included specific coordinates for logistical hubs, energy distribution networks, and communication relay points that were critical to maintaining the blockade. Their assessment showed how targeted disruptions could neutralize the Kyrian threat without direct military engagement, using precise interventions that would collapse their operational capacity through systemic failures rather than ship-to-ship combat. The comprehensiveness of their intelligence demonstrated how thoroughly they'd prepared for this exact scenario during their years of exile. Here's the thing about bullies: they never expect the victim to have better toys. The Kyrian Empire had spent centuries perfecting intimidation tactics that worked against species who fought conventionally, but they weren't prepared for opponents who turned industrial equipment into strategic weapons. Their tactical assessments assumed human defenses would rely on standard military hardware, not repurposed civilian technology enhanced with alien scientific principles. This arrogance created the exact blind spot that human Velnar engineers exploited with almost poetic precision. Human Velnar engineers modified mining lasers into phased energy weapons using Velnar quantum targeting. They took heavy industrial lasers designed for asteroid fragmentation and recalibrated their emission arrays to concentrate energy into precise frequency bands that could penetrate Kyrian shielding. The quantum targeting systems allowed these modified weapons to identify structural weaknesses in enemy vessels that conventional targeting computers would miss. The conversion process happened in orbital workshops that normally served mining operations, using fabrication tools that were never intended for weapons production. Technicians worked around the clock recalibrating focusing crystals and power conduits, while Velnar physicists adjusted quantum entanglement matrices to optimize targeting precision. The Kyrian fleet outnumbered human defenses 50-1 with superior firepower and shielding. Their battle formations stretched across tactical displays like metal clouds, with capital ships displacing more mass than some small moons. Each warship carried energy weapons capable of glassing planetary surfaces and shield generators that could withstand direct hits from nuclear ordnance. Their sensor networks could track objects across entire star systems, and their communication systems operated with encryption that had never been broken by any species. The sheer scale of their military presence demonstrated why they'd dominated regional politics for centuries, without serious challenge. Velnar tactical analysts identified a pattern. In Kyrian command decisions, they always sacrificed left flank first. Their battle simulations revealed that Kyrian admirals consistently deployed weaker vessels on their formation's left side, using them as buffer units while concentrating offensive power on the right. This tactical preference appeared in 87% of historical engagements across 2 centuries of Kyrian military records. The pattern reflected deep cultural biases in their strategic thinking that prioritized offensive maneuvering over defensive stability. Their command structure valued aggressive action so highly that they willingly accepted asymmetrical losses on one flank to maintain offensive pressure. Elsewhere, humanity didn't destroy the fleet. They hacked their navigation systems and sent them into a nearby star. Cyber warfare teams used backdoors in Kyrian communication protocols that the Velnar had identified during their exile. The attack didn't target weapons or shields, but instead inserted false astronomical data into navigation computers. Kyrian vessels suddenly perceived safe space as hazardous and hazardous space as safe, causing their automated systems to chart courses directly toward the system's primary star. The fleet's own safety protocols prevented manual override during what the computers classified as emergency collision avoidance maneuvers. Within hours, the entire invasion force was accelerating toward stellar annihilation, while human and Velnar observers monitored their progress without firing a single weapon. The solution demonstrated how understanding an enemy's technology could be more effective than matching their firepower. Let me show you what happens when 2 species stop trying to coexist and start becoming something new. I've witnessed countless first contact scenarios where civilizations maintain careful boundaries and diplomatic distance, preserving their cultural distinctness like museum pieces behind glass. What happened between humans and Velnar was different, less like neighbors building a fence and more like 2 rivers merging into a stronger current. They didn't just share resources. They began rewriting their fundamental definitions of identity. The first hybrid children were born with neural structures capable of interfacing directly with technology. Their brain architecture incorporated Velnar quantum processing nodes with human emotional processing centers, creating consciousness patterns that could perceive machine code as naturally as language. These children could troubleshoot electrical systems by touch and optimize software through what appeared to be instinct rather than calculation. Medical scans showed their neural activity patterns fluctuating between biological and digital frequencies in ways that defied existing neurology models. Their development teams had to design entirely new educational frameworks that accommodated their integrated perception of physical and digital realities. Traditionalists on both sides protested loss of cultural purity and biological contamination. Human isolationists organized demonstrations citing religious objections to hybridization, while Velnar traditionalists warned about dilution of their genetic heritage. Both groups filed legal challenges attempting to restrict cross-species reproduction and cultural integration programs. The opposition created temporary political divisions that threatened to reverse years of cooperation, with some factions advocating for segregated living zones and separate development paths. The debates grew increasingly heated as more hybrid children were born, forcing both societies to confront whether their future involved separation or synthesis. They developed a new language that used human emotional depth with Velnar mathematical precision. The hybrid communication system incorporated tonal variations from human speech with the precise symbolic logic of Velnar technical notation. This allowed speakers to convey complex technical concepts while maintaining emotional context, something both species' languages had struggled to achieve separately. The language naturally evolved through daily use rather than formal construction, with children often leading its development through their integrated understanding of both linguistic traditions. Within 2 generations, it became the primary language for scientific, research and artistic expression. Across the integrated community, the first joint government election was won by a human Velnar coalition promising continued evolution. Their platform rejected separationist policies in favor of accelerated integration, proposing shared educational systems and combined technological development initiatives. The coalition candidates included both species and hybrid individuals, representing the first political organization that truly reflected the emerging blended society. Their victory margin surprised analysts who had predicted more conservative outcomes, indicating that despite vocal opposition, most citizens had embraced the direction their civilization was taking. The election results marked the formal beginning of governance structures designed for synthesis rather than coexistence. This transformation unfolded through countless small moments: human chefs learning, Velnar light recipes, Velnar engineers adopting human problem-solving frameworks, children teaching each other games that blended physical and digital play. The cultural fusion created new art forms that used light patterns with sound vibrations, new musical scales that incorporated quantum harmonics, and new architectural styles that balanced organic curves with precise geometric patterns. What began as emergency shelter had become the foundation for something neither species could have created alone: a civilization that valued integration as strength rather than fearing it as contamination. You know how the story ends? With everyone who said no suddenly wanting to say please. I've seen galactic power shifts before, but never one where the begging came wrapped in such fancy diplomatic packaging. The same civilizations that couldn't spare a cup of water for the Velnar refugees suddenly developed great interest in technology sharing agreements and mutual defense pacts. Their diplomatic overtures arrived on encrypted channels with elaborate apologies for previous misunderstandings and invitations to discuss mutually beneficial partnerships. The transformation from rejection to supplication happened so fast it left diplomatic analysts checking their calendar systems for temporal anomalies. The Galactic Council offered humanity full membership status in exchange for Velnar expulsion. Their proposal included voting rights, trade privileges, and military protection. Everything a young spacefaring civilization could supposedly want. The offer came with detailed specifications about which Velnar needed to be removed, from which territories, and timelines for compliance. Council ambassadors presented it as reasonable compromise, arguing that one species' membership was fair exchange for another species' exclusion. They even included economic impact studies showing how human markets would benefit from preferred trade status within established galactic networks. Humanity's response was broadcast across known space. We keep our friends closer than our opportunities. The transmission used the same Sumerian encryption protocol from their original invitation to the Velnar, creating symbolic continuity between the two messages. The statement wasn't accompanied by explanations or justifications, just those 7 words repeated across every communication frequency for 24 standard hours. The simplicity of the message contrasted sharply with the Council's elaborate proposal, making their complex offer seem overly bureaucratic and self-serving by comparison. The transmission strength was calibrated to ensure even the most distant listening posts could receive it clearly. 17 refugee species subsequently bypassed the Council to appeal directly to humanity. Their requests came through unofficial channels, often using smuggled communication devices or third-party intermediaries to avoid Council monitoring. These were species that had been denied recognition for centuries, living in hidden colonies or marginal territories where the Council's influence was minimal. Their appeals described conditions far worse than what the Velnar had faced: complete exclusion from galactic society rather than simple rejection. They'd monitored humanity's treatment of the Velnar and decided their best hope lay with this unconventional, new power rather than established institutions. The Council's reaction involved emergency sessions and increasingly desperate counteroffers. They proposed modified membership terms, special exceptions, and even temporary status arrangements that would theoretically allow the Velnar to remain under restricted conditions. Each new proposal contained more concessions than the last, revealing how thoroughly they'd misjudged human priorities. Their diplomatic teams seemed incapable of understanding that humanity valued relationships over transactions, consistently offering better deals, rather than examining why their initial offer had been rejected. This fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology created ongoing communication breakdowns, where both sides seemed to be speaking different languages despite using perfect, Translations. The shift in diplomatic approach demonstrated how completely the power dynamics had reversed. Civilizations that had once dictated terms from positions of strength were now negotiating from weakness, while humanity found itself setting conditions for organizations that had previously ignored its existence. This reversal wasn't just about military or technological advantage. It reflected a fundamental realignment of what constituted value in interstellar relations. Ethical reputation had become more valuable than fleet size, and innovation capacity mattered more than territorial control. The galactic playground had new rules, and the kids who used to own the swing set were suddenly asking for turns. So there we are. The species nobody wanted now defines galactic civilization's moral compass. It's one thing to win a war or dominate economically, but it's something else entirely to rewrite the ethical framework that entire civilizations operate under. The Velnar went from being cosmic beggars to setting the standards that even ancient empires had to acknowledge, not through weapons or threats, but through demonstrated principles that proved more effective than centuries of diplomatic tradition. Human Velnar teams established the first interspecies university, focusing on crisis response and diplomacy. They built the campus on a converted orbital station that once served as a refugee processing center, intentionally keeping the industrial infrastructure visible as a reminder of its origins. The curriculum combined Velnar systemic analysis with human pragmatic adaptation, creating training programs that could simulate everything from environmental disasters to first contact scenarios. Admission was based on practical problem-solving ability rather than political connections or species status, with entrance exams that tested ethical decision-making under pressure rather than academic knowledge. Traditional galactic powers attempted to sabotage admissions and discredit graduates. They planted agents in the applicant pool to spread dissent and leaked fabricated reports about security breaches in the training programs. Diplomatic pressure was applied to species considering sending students, with threats of trade restrictions and political isolation for those who participated. When these tactics failed, they tried to create rival institutions with luxurious facilities and prestigious faculty. But these new schools lacked the practical experience that came from having actually survived and solved real crises. The opposition only made the original university more respected, as applicants recognized that those trying to destroy it clearly felt threatened by what it represented. Their first graduating class included refugees from 12 previously ignored species. These were beings from civilizations that the galactic community had written off as too primitive, too dangerous, or too different to participate in interstellar affairs. The university's practical approach allowed them to demonstrate capabilities that traditional education systems would have overlooked, with crisis simulation performance mattering more than pedigree or political connections. Their success stories became powerful advertisements for the institution's methods, proving that effective leadership could emerge from anywhere if given proper training and opportunity. The university's charter became the foundation for new galactic ethical standards. Its principles of inclusive decision-making and crisis response protocols were adopted by 17 major civilizations within 5 years. The standards emphasized practical solutions over ideological purity and valued diverse perspectives in problem-solving. This represented a fundamental shift from the previous galactic model of isolated specialization to integrated cooperation, with the university serving as both symbol and engine of this transformation. Its influence extended beyond diplomacy into trade, environmental management, and conflict resolution, creating a consistent framework that multiple species could apply according to their specific circumstances. What began as an educational experiment became the reference point for how civilized species should behave toward one another. The standards didn't eliminate conflict or disagreement, but they provided tools for resolving differences without resorting to destruction or exclusion. Civilizations that adopted them found they could achieve their objectives more effectively through cooperation than through confrontation, creating incentives for even reluctant powers to eventually participate. The university's continuing evolution ensured these standards remained practical rather than theoretical, constantly refined through real-world application rather than abstract debate. Here's the thing nobody asks. What did the Velnar sacrifice to make this work? Their integration wasn't just about learning human languages or adjusting to our gravity. Their historical records revealed they'd abandoned religious practices that conflicted with human values. They eliminated spiritual ceremonies that involved mild psychoactive compounds and altered rituals that required solitary meditation during daylight hours, when human work schedules demanded interaction. Their spiritual leaders voluntarily dissolved religious hierarchies that didn't align with human organizational structures, essentially dismantling centuries of theological tradition to avoid cultural friction. These changes created silent generational divides where older Velnar mourned lost traditions while younger generations adapted to new hybrid practices. They suppressed their natural reproductive cycles to avoid overwhelming human resources. Their biological norm involved synchronized breeding periods every 3 years that would have produced population spikes humanity's infrastructure couldn't accommodate. Medical teams administered hormonal regulators that delayed pregnancies indefinitely, creating physiological stress that manifested in various health complications. The decision wasn't negotiated or requested, it was preemptive, based on their analysis of human resource allocation patterns and settlement capacities. This voluntary population control meant entire genetic lines might end with the current generation, a sacrifice they made without consulting humanity because they understood the mathematical reality of resource limitations better than anyone. Older Velnar voluntarily entered memory erasure programs to forget traumatic pre-exile experiences. The programs targeted specific memories of planetfall tragedies and loss separation events that caused persistent psychological distress. The process wasn't perfect. It sometimes erased associated memories of loved ones or cultural knowledge, creating gaps in personal histories that couldn't be recovered. These elders woke up with vague unease about their past rather than sharp trauma, trading precise suffering for generalized disorientation. The treatment centers operated continuously during the first 5 years of settlement, with waiting lists that stretched for months as the demand far exceeded available neurological resources. Humanity discovered these sacrifices years later and began their own adaptations in response. Medical researchers found the hormonal regulators while studying Velnar aging patterns and realized the extent of their population control measures. Cultural anthropologists pieced together the religious abandonment through comparisons of early settlement records with pre-exile cultural databases. The discoveries triggered widespread reevaluation of integration policies and resource allocation models. Human communities started adjusting work schedules to accommodate Velnar spiritual practices and developed assisted reproductive technologies that could support their natural breeding cycles without overwhelming infrastructure. The response wasn't about repayment. It was about recognizing that true partnership required mutual adjustment rather than one-sided sacrifice. This reciprocal adaptation became the foundation for the fully integrated society that would eventually emerge, built on the understanding that compassion works best when it flows both directions. Let me leave you with this. One decision created a cascade that's still reshaping the galaxy. I've watched empires rise and fall based on military campaigns and economic maneuvers, but never because someone chose compassion over convenience. The initial choice to welcome the Velnar didn't just save their species. It triggered a fundamental realignment of how civilizations interact across interstellar distances. The effects spread through diplomatic channels and cultural exchanges like resonance waves from a quantum event, amplifying far beyond the original point of impact. 37 previously isolationist species have since opened borders to limited refugee admissions. These were civilizations that had maintained closed-door policies for centuries, citing everything from biological security to cultural preservation. Their policy shifts weren't dramatic declarations but gradual adjustments, first allowing scientific exchange programs, then accepting small groups of displaced researchers, eventually establishing formal refugee quotas. The changes occurred without fanfare, as if everyone had simultaneously realized that isolationism provided less protection than controlled engagement. Monitoring stations began detecting new traffic patterns along formerly quiet border zones, with previously dormant diplomatic channels suddenly active with resource allocation discussions and cultural compatibility studies. The economic balance of power shifted from military might to ethical reputation and innovation capacity. Civilizations that previously invested in fleet expansions started redirecting resources toward technological development and humanitarian infrastructure. Trade agreements began, including ethical compliance clauses that affected market access more than tariff regulations. The most sought-after trading partners weren't those with the largest warships, but those with the most reliable conflict mediation records and innovative resource management systems. This recalibration of value systems created new economic leaders almost overnight, with previously marginal systems gaining influence through their commitment to sustainable development and ethical governance. 5 major conflicts have been prevented through human Velnar-mediated diplomacy rather than military intervention. Their approach involved bringing conflicting parties together, not for negotiation but for collaborative problem-solving, focusing on shared challenges rather than opposing positions. One standoff over mineral rights was resolved by developing synthetic alternatives that made the contested resources irrelevant. Another border dispute ended when both sides agreed to joint administration of the territory for ecological preservation. The mediation teams excelled at identifying underlying interests that the conflicting parties hadn't even recognized themselves, creating solutions that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. The Velnar homeworld is now being terraformed using hybrid technology for all species to share. The Restoration Project uses atmospheric processors that combine human engineering precision with Velnar quantum material science, reversing the entropy wave damage through controlled reality stabilization. The planet isn't being returned to its original state but transformed into something new, a shared sanctuary with multiple environment zones tailored to different species requirements. The project funding comes from a collective resource pool with contributions from dozens of civilizations, and oversight involves representatives from formerly conflicting factions working alongside original inhabitants. The restoration symbolizes the ultimate rejection of the isolationist thinking that nearly condemned the Velnar to extinction, demonstrating how shared challenges can create stronger bonds than shared histories ever could. The point is, we thought compassion was a weakness until it became our greatest strategic advantage. When you file your report on this era, make sure you get the details right. It wasn't about saving them, it was about saving ourselves from becoming just another cold, calculating power in the galaxy. That single act of defiance against cosmic indifference rewrote our future. Tell the truth and let the consequences sort themselves out, they usually do. Sometimes the bravest strategy is just to do the decent thing and see what happens next.